I am 78 years old, and for most of my life, I stayed in a life I didn't want. I didn't shout about it, and I didn't leave. I just stayed. I think the hardest part is admitting that, even now. I spent decades sitting in a quiet unhappiness, pretending it was fine. And the truth is, I didn't even realize how much I was giving up by staying until it was too late. When I was young, I thought life was simple. I finished school, got a job, got married. That's what everyone did, isn't it? My parents expected it, my friends expected it, and I expected it too, without really thinking. I remember walking home from my first office job, the winter wind cold on my face, and feeling this small, gnawing sense that this wasn't for me. But I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find my way later. I met people along the way, friends, colleagues, neighbors, people who laughed and talked about dreams. I smiled and nodded. I didn't tell them I felt stuck, and I didn't even tell myself. I told myself I was practical, responsible, that someday I'd be grateful I stayed. And for a while, that thought was enough. The thing is, the life I built wasn't bad. It had food on the table, a roof over my head, familiarity, and yet it had a quiet emptiness that grew every year. I can still picture my living room from those years, the brown couch, the clock that ticked too loudly in the evenings, the curtains that never really let in the light. I would sit there, sometimes for hours, just staring. Not sad, not angry, just waiting for something I didn't even know existed. I convinced myself that dissatisfaction was normal, that everyone had moments like that. I didn't quit my job even when I hated it. I didn't speak up when I felt unseen. I didn't leave the marriage that quietly, slowly drained me. I kept moving through the days, one after another. I remember my evenings best, washing dishes, sitting in a chair, listening to silence, wondering if this was all life had to offer. And it wasn't even dramatic. No shouting, no fights, just a slow fading of something I couldn't name. I began to notice a pattern forming in myself. I avoided people who asked questions about dreams or happiness. I learned to find comfort in small routines, making tea at the same time, walking the same path, buying the same groceries. Those routines became walls I didn't even realize I had built. They kept me safe from thinking too much about change, from imagining something different. I remember my younger colleagues at work, brimming with energy and hope. They'd talk about quitting to follow a passion or moving to a new city, and I'd smile quietly, saying nothing. Inside, I felt something twist, a mixture of envy and fear. I envied their courage, but I feared the unknown so much that I couldn't imagine taking a step like that myself. So I stayed. At home, the same quiet acceptance played out. The house was orderly, the bills were paid, the routine kept rolling. I wasn't unhappy in bursts. I was quietly unhappy, day after day. I remember nights sitting on the couch, the television flickering with shows I didn't care for, the kitchen clock ticking, and thinking, is this really it? Is this all? And then I'd put it out of my mind. Because admitting it aloud was too painful. Admitting it to myself was harder still. I stayed because leaving felt impossible. It didn't matter that I felt trapped. It didn't matter that there were small sparks inside me, the urge to write, to learn, to travel, to feel more alive. I convinced myself that life had duties and responsibilities, and that my desires were secondary. And so, year after year, I tucked those sparks away. I got used to the quiet emptiness. I learned how to live in it, even to find a little comfort in it. There were times when I almost made a change, small moments that could have turned into something bigger. Once I considered applying for a different job. I even looked at apartments in a city I liked, but every time, the voice inside my head whispered that it was foolish, dangerous, selfish. So I didn't go. I stayed, and I practiced convincing myself that staying was sensible, that one day I'd be thankful. Even vacations became mirrors of this life. I remember sitting on a bench by the ocean once, waves rolling in, children laughing nearby. I thought about running away from everything I had built just for a little while, but I didn't. I stayed. I went home, and I let the quiet heaviness settle back into me. I realized slowly that the life I stayed in had become a kind of routine prison. I wasn't locked in by anyone but myself. I wasn't screamed at, threatened, or forced. I was bound by habit, by fear, by a long practice of telling myself it was easier to endure than to try. And that practice, once established, was hard to break. Looking back, I see now that the early signs were there, whispering quietly. That uneasy feeling when the office smelled like papers and coffee, the restless hours after dinner, the small regrets that rose and fell like tides. I could have listened, but I chose not to. And each year, the listening became harder. The habit of staying in the wrong life grew stronger until I barely remembered the person I might have been if I had tried something different. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had taken one small step differently. I imagine mornings where I left work early to follow a class, evenings spent in conversation with people who inspired me, a life built on choices that made me feel awake. And I feel a quiet ache in that imagining, a tiny regret that lingers even now. But those days, those decades, also taught me something subtle. I learned how deeply fear and habit can shape a life without shouting or drama. I learned how easy it is to convince yourself that practical is better than fulfilling. I learned too late that life doesn't wait. It doesn't nudge you kindly. It flows on, leaving behind what you chose not to chase. It wasn't a big event that made me see the truth. There was no sudden tragedy, no dramatic scene. One evening, I was sitting alone in the living room, the same brown couch, the same ticking clock, thinking about a question my daughter asked me years ago. She asked if I was happy. I said I was fine. But for a moment, I realized I had spent decades saying fine when I wasn't. That small, quiet clarity hit me harder than I expected. I could see myself for the first time in years, not the routines, not the obligations, not the comfort, but the choices I had avoided. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just felt a strange stillness, a recognition. I saw how my habits had protected me from discomfort, but also trapped me. I saw the things I had tucked away, the books I never wrote, the letters I never sent, the trips I never took. I saw the quiet years I had spent convincing myself that practicality was better than fulfillment, and I understood how easily fear had guided my life. After that evening, I began noticing other things I had ignored. I noticed the friendships that drifted away because I never really opened up. I noticed the conversations I had avoided at work because I didn't want to stand out. I noticed how many chances I had let pass because I thought it was too late to change, or too risky. It was painful, but it wasn't dramatic. It was a slow accumulation of truth, quietly sitting in the corners of my life. The consequences of staying were subtle, but real. I lost friends. I lost moments of laughter. I lost the chance to learn new things or try new experiences. I didn't travel much. I didn't pursue ideas or hobbies that could have mattered to me. While I had a life that worked, it was always quieter, emptier than it might have been. The losses weren't loud, they were the invisible ones, the things you don't notice until you try to remember what you once wanted. And yet, I don't feel bitterness. I don't dwell in shame. I feel a quiet sadness, the kind that sits softly in your chest. I also feel understanding. I stayed because leaving felt impossible. I stayed because habit and fear were stronger than desire. I stayed because I didn't realize that courage can be ordinary, quiet, and small. Choices made day by day rather than in one bold act. If I could speak to someone younger, someone in the middle of life, I would say this softly. Notice yourself. Pay attention to the small discomforts. Notice the things that feel off or missing. Don't ignore them, even if they seem inconvenient. Life doesn't always give a dramatic wake-up call. Often it's the quiet nudges you have to notice before they turn into regret. You don't have to make a giant leap. Small, careful steps are enough to start shaping a life that feels yours. I've also learned that it's never too late to notice. I can't reclaim the decades I spent avoiding myself. I can't go back and take the chances I missed. But I can notice today. I can make small choices that matter to me, even in ordinary ways. I can let myself feel little sparks of curiosity or joy, and that is something. It may seem small, but it counts. It's enough to begin, even at my age. Some days I still sit on that brown couch, and I feel the old heaviness. But I also feel a faint lightness. I notice the books I haven't read, the letters I haven't written, the small things I can do that make me feel present. It's not excitement or drama. It's simply noticing, and it matters more than I can say. The quiet truth of life I've learned is this: happiness isn't always loud or dramatic. It isn't always something you can chase with one bold act. Often it's in paying attention, in noticing, in giving yourself permission to feel even a little. Ignoring it doesn't help. Staying in a life that quietly drains you only makes the weight heavier with each passing year. So here I am, 78, quietly admitting I stayed too long in a life I didn't want, quietly noticing what I can still do, quietly accepting what I lost without dwelling in regret, and quietly finding small pieces of freedom in awareness. It's not a story of triumph. It's not a story of disaster. It's a story of living honestly, at last, even if it comes late. Maybe that's enough. To notice, to choose even in small ways, to accept what has been, and to live the rest with some quiet truth. That is what I have now. That is what I want to leave behind, even if no one hears it. It's enough to be honest, and that, I think, is a kind of peace.